You said.
All right, Matthew 26, verse 47. So, what? Okay. So we have we this is really the continuation of the sorrow, really, that Jesus begins last week in the prayer. Now we kind of see some of the actions that come out, and it's just the response of his disciples here is not exactly what we're looking for. So I will remind you that this is early Friday morning. They've had the Passover Thursday night. There will be another Passover for the Jews in Jerusalem tonight. And again, as I've mentioned, during his crucifixion. So this is Friday. So let me just read verse 47 and then get into it. It says, "And while he was still speaking, behold, Judas, one of the 12, with a great multitude with swords and clubs, came from the chief priests and the elders of the people." So, it says while he was still speaking. So let's go back to verse 45 and 46, right? This is what he's speaking. He came to the disciples and said, "Are you still sleeping and resting? Behold, the hour is at hand. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand." So while he's saying that, Judas shows up. Judas, leading this multitude, shows up as he's saying, "Rise." And if you remember last week, it's "Rise, let us be going. Let's go towards them. Let's meet them." He goes towards the crowd. One thing, just as a note that I found out as we were going through the commentaries, this indication of Judas, one of the 12. That phrase, one of the 12, is only used 7 times in Scripture. 6 times it refers to Judas. Judas, one of the 12. Judas, one of the 12. The other time is to Thomas when he's denying Christ. Thomas, one of the 12. So many of the commentaries indicate that this is not this is somewhat of a statement of derision, that he's just one of the 12. Nothing special about him. He's just one of the 12. I think that the gospel writers are frankly amazed that this person who is one of the 12 is doing what he is doing, and so they kind of use this language to indicate, yeah, he was even one of the 12, and he's still doing the things that he's doing. You'll notice here that the disciples, as we looked at last week, were all sleeping in the garden. Judas, however, was not. As I mentioned last week, the demons and the devils were very active during that time, and Judas also very active. He had met with the chief priests and the scribes. He'd come up with this plan. They'd figured out that we can meet him in the garden. It'll be dark. It's away from the city, away from the crowds. So all this was going on, again, while the disciples were sleeping. Anyway, so then a great multitude with swords and clubs came from the chief priests, the elders, and the people. A great multitude. I want you to turn to John chapter 18. And by the way, we're going to be looking at John and Luke both for a couple of things here. So if you want to mark these so you can get back to them. But mark John chapter 18. I just want to look at, we can just look at verse 2 and 3. John chapter 18, verse 2. It says, "Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, for Jesus often met there with his disciples." Some people have asked, how did Judas know where Jesus was? Well, it was a common place that Jesus went and rested. So Judas certainly knew. Verse 3, though, "Then Judas, having received a detachment of troops and officers from the chief priests and Pharisees, came there with lanterns, torches, and weapons." So this is a little strange, right? Judas, having received a detachment of troops and officers from the chief priests and Pharisees. So what's interesting is that during the time of great festivals, the Romans would actually give a a cohort of troops to the chief priest in order to keep order. Now, a cohort of troops was about 600 men. Okay, so when we talk here that Judas received a detachment of troops, he gets 600 men from the Romans, from the chief priests who were given them from the Romans, as part of this multitude that comes up. And then it says, and the officers are really the guards of the chief priests, and there may well have been 100 of those officers, guards that came with the chief priests. So you got the 600 of the troops of the Romans. You've got the officers. They came there with, in Matthew it says with swords and clubs. Very likely the swords are with the Romans. The clubs are with the officers, which are just something that they would use. Now you gotta ask your question: why so many people? So you also have, you notice, you remember that, right? He cuts off the servant's ear of the chief priest. So there's also servants around, right? There could well have been 1,000 people that are coming up this hill in order to arrest Jesus. I just have never thought about that before. This is a big crowd. This is a multitude, as it says back in Matthew. Why do they bring so many people? Any thoughts on that?
Seen him perform miracles, and they knew he had great power.
Right.
I mean, a lot of them probably were just curious.
I don't think the Roman soldiers were curious. They were under orders, but
You're 1,000. You're saying it's 1,000 Roman soldiers?
600 Roman soldiers and guards. But yeah, they were probably onlookers. There are servants. There are others who see a crowd going up the mountain. They probably joined them.
Sorry,
But-
they just crowd.
Sorry?
Maybe
I
they
didn't hear
did.
that.
Yeah, were they worried about the crowd? I mean, other people who might
Check.
riot or be upset about what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, part of what the chief priests and scribes are telling the Romans is this guy is planning an insurrection. He's planning a rebellion, right? And he's got all of his, quote, disciples up there on the mountain, just planning this insurrection. So you better bring a big crowd in order to capture him, because otherwise of course there's, we know there's 12 of them, right? But the chief priests are building this up, and so so they bring this giant crowd in order to arrest Jesus, right? 1,000 people against one, or against 12. It's kind of an amazing picture. I just hadn't thought about that before, about the size of the crowd. They come to him with swords and clubs, and they come from the chief priests and the elders, right? So the chief priests and the elders are also there, or at least a portion of them are there. Certainly, Caiaphas's servant is there, so Caiaphas is there. They come from they're under orders from them in order to get Jesus. All right, keep going. Verse 48. Now his betrayer was given them a sign, saying, "Whomever I kiss, he is the one. Seize him." So this is the most devastating part of this whole thing to me. I mean, this is Judas coming up to him, giving him this kiss. This kiss would be typically a sign of respect and love. In Eastern traditions, it's a normal greeting, but it would certainly be a sign of respect. Now, why would the multitude need a sign? Would they need Judas to kiss him?
It was dark.
It was dark. And probably, frankly, many of them didn't know who he was. They probably had heard about him, particularly the Romans, right? They're not interested in what's going on in this little Jewish nation that they're taking care of, right? So it was to identify him, to pick him out of the crowd and say, this is the one that you're trying to seize. This is the one that you're after. And it's interesting here, right? He says, seize him. In some of the other gospels says seize and bind him, right? It was, you guys have got to grab him. He's slippery. right? We have seen seen Jesus slip through the crowd before, right? They've tried to arrest him before, and he has all of a sudden vanished out of the crowd. So Judas has seen this occur. So he has said, "Hey, you got to seize him. You got to bind him. You got to make sure that you got him." It's you know, we'll come back to this, but just to think through Judas at this point coming up to Jesus in a very personal way and giving him a kiss. And then also in verse 49, it says, immediately he went up to Jesus and said, "Greetings, Rabbi," and kissed him. So this greetings, Rabbi, is the word greetings is more of a it's a joyful greeting. It's a peace be to you, Rabbi. Be well, Rabbi. It's a normal, very joyful greeting that he would bring to him, and he does that, along with this kiss. Now, the other thing I think that's going on here is Judas is trying to not only give a sign to the Romans, but he's also trying to deceive Jesus and the disciples, right? He's just one of them. He's just greeting Jesus, saying hello, giving him a kiss. He's thinking Jesus isn't going to figure out that he's really betraying him. Of course, Jesus knows all along who's going to betray him and what's going on, right? Disciples, they may be confused, but Jesus has absolutely, he knows what's going on here. But recognize that, and we'll see that come back into play in a little bit. But Judas, I believe, is also trying to deceive Jesus and the disciples with this kiss and with this greeting.
Yeah, so Rick, that was one of the things I was thinking about saying, was that this is also sneaky.
Yeah.
So he's doing this so people aren't realizing sure, you got 600 soldiers, but he's trying to, like I say, he's trying to cover himself.
Well, it's very likely from the wording in some of the Gospels that Judas came on a little bit ahead of the crowd, right? He came to Jesus and had this greeting. The others could see him, but they weren't really, the whole crowd wasn't there yet when he gave this greeting. So yeah, sneaky is the right word. All right, verse 50, then we see Jesus' response. It says, "But Jesus said to him, 'Friend, why have you come?' Then they came and laid hands on Jesus and took him." So first of all, the word friend here is really a bad translation of this word. Some of yours may have others. He's not saying friend. He's saying fellow or person or companion. It's a little bit of a cut to Judas, this name, right? Because it wasn't that long ago that he was saying to the disciples, you have called me friend, in using the right word for friend. But here he's using a lesser word for friend, which really means this fellow came up to him, hey you, hey buddy, why have you come, right? It's a little bit of a cut to Judas, and we'll see more about that. The other thing is, let me just ask you guys, what the quote that Jesus says there, mine says, "Friend, why have you come?" What does your translation say?
Mine says, "Friend, do what you came for."
That's what it says too. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So what's interesting about this, the Greek here, is what it actually says is, "What you are here to do." And then it doesn't say anything else. And so the translators, for those of you who read that last part, is, what you are here to do it, right? What you're here to do it. And that certainly jives with, what he said back at the Lord's Supper, right? Go and do it quickly, right? That makes sense. But all he really said is what you are here to do, or what are you here to do? Which is the way mine kind of translated, why have you come, right? So I find it intriguing that this is when Jesus is there, Judas comes up to him, he greets him, he gives him his kiss, and he kind of says, why are you here? What is this about, Judas? I really do think this is showing Jesus' one last chance for Judas. One last chance to say, I don't want to do what I'm about to do. I am not going to, go through with this. Run, Jesus, and get out of here. The Romans are about to get right. I think when he asked that question, and he calls him companion and fellow, I think Judas's response to that would be a little bit of that hurts. And when he asked him, why are you here? He wanted Judas to think through, what is he really doing? It was to have him to see his own sin, to see the depth to which he has fallen. Now, Judas doesn't respond to it in a positive way, but I think, it shows us the kind of amazing love of Jesus, even in the worst of times, right? This is the worst time, right? He's going to be arrested, and he's given this man one more chance of forgiveness. And this man, above all other men, probably didn't deserve forgiveness, but he gives him one more chance here by asking this question, by getting him to see his own sin. And the broader statement here to me is, if this man, in the midst of this sin, can be forgiven, who is outside of God's love, right? That's to me, that's just a beautiful, wonderful, amazing thing about Christ, is there's no one outside of his love. Even in the midst of him being captured, betrayed by a close friend, he still gives him one more chance. Judas, of course, doesn't take it. The other thing just to think about for a minute is Jesus, we've seen the humanity of Jesus last week in the garden, right? What could have been Jesus's response in this situation as a human? Maybe I should ask, what would your response have been in this situation, right? Anger, lashing out, no telling what kind of stuff would come out of our mouths, right? When we see Judas do this. But I think the thing to remember is Jesus prepared himself for this moment in the garden, right? This is what the battle in the garden was all about. This is what the wrestling in the garden was all about, to be ready for this moment such that he could respond with calm, peace, with knowing this was all part of God's plan. We've said it many times, but that prayerful preparation before the struggles come is what gives him great power. All right, the end of this verse says, they came and laid hands on Jesus and took him. Again, I just got to say, the only reason that happens is because Jesus allows it, right? I do want us to go back, because there's a whole portion of the story that's not told to us here. I do want us to go back to John 18 again. So if you kept your finger there, you can get back there quickly. But John 18, we actually want to pick this story up. We'll start in verse 1 to get the whole picture. John 18, it says, when Jesus had spoken these words, he went out with his disciples over the brook Kidron, where there was a garden, and he and his disciples entered. And Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, for Jesus often met there and was his disciples. Then Judas, having received a detachment of troops and officers from the chief priests and Pharisees, came there with lanterns, torches, and weapons. Jesus, therefore, knowing all things that would come upon him, went forward and said to him, whom are you speaking? And they answered him, Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus said to him, I am he. And Judas, who betrayed him, also stood with them. Now when he said to them, I am he, they drew back and fell to the ground. Then he asked them again, whom are you seeking? They said, Jesus of Nazareth. And Jesus answered, I have told you that I am he. Therefore, if you seek me, let these go their way. So this whole interaction where Jesus says, I am he uses the biblical words, right? I am. and the crowd drew back and falls to the ground is not in any of the other gospels. It's only here in John. But again, they ask him who he is. They ask him if he's Jesus of Nazareth. He says, "I am." The crowd is blown away by that physically, but amazingly, it doesn't affect them. Right? It doesn't impact them. Hey, we've just all get knocked to the ground. Let's get back up, and now we need to go and arrest this guy. I mean, the miracles of Jesus had no impact on the unbelievers, and you see that again here. Without faith, the miracles are not of any use, and there's no impact here on these people. They fall back, and then they come back, and then the other thing here, just note in verse 8. I told you that I am he, therefore, if you seek me, let these go their way. He's here also protecting the disciples, saying, okay, come and get me, but let the rest of these leave. Now, let's go back to Matthew chapter 50. So again, so finally after this, right, after he blows them away, they come back, and he does allow them to lay hands on Jesus and take him away. And some of the other gospels say, and to bound him. They bound him at this point and took him away. Now, verse 41, it says, and suddenly one of those who were with Jesus stretched out his hand, drew his sword, struck the servant of the high priest, and cut off his ear. Now, again, there's a little piece of the story missing here, and that piece is actually in, I've lost my place, in Luke. So Luke 22 is the other place that we're going to look for a couple of things. So if you have a couple of extra fingers, you can go to Luke 22. So Luke 22, I want you to actually look at verse 49. Luke 22, verse 49. It says, when those around him saw what was going to happen, they said to him, Lord, shall we strike with the sword? So the disciples, we beat up Peter all the time. But the disciples were all saying, Lord, is it time to pull out the swords? Is it time to fight? Is it time for us to get him? And if we go back to John, we don't need to look at it right now, but if you go back to John, you'll see that John identifies that the one who pulls out the sword is Peter, not a surprise to any of us, right? Who pulls out the sword is Peter. He cuts off the servant's ear. They do say that's the servant of Caiaphas. His name is Malchus, again identified in John. But here what you see is the disciples, all of them, right, are all ready to pull out their swords. John is the one, Peter is the one who actually does it. But he pulls out the sword and he cuts off the ear of the high priest's servant. Now, by the way, you should know that the servant of the high priest would be a very important person. This would not be, somebody cleaning the floors, right? The servant of the high priest is somebody who would represent the high priest, who would speak for the high priest. And so with Peter cutting off the ear of the high priest, that would be a big deal. It's not just some lowly servant who he's taking vengeance on here. The other thing, again, go back to Luke a minute. Yeah, go ahead.
Something that pops into my head there is that he picked somebody who's probably not armed.
I'm sorry, what?
He picked somebody who was not armed.
Yeah, he picked somebody that was not armed. He may have picked the one who actually grabbed Jesus, because it would not be surprising again that the servant of the high priest would be the one who actually, put his hands on Jesus. So it may be that he was he was responding to the one who actually grabbed Jesus and bound him. So, it was somebody who was unarmed. He didn't cut the ear off a Roman soldier, right?
It's a real important part, but was this guy just a bad aim?
Probably so. Yeah, I think it's very likely he's trying to cut his head off. He's not a person. The other thing is, you remember these swords that they used. We see the Roman swords as one thing. The sword that Peter had was probably one that he put in his belt, probably a short sword, maybe a foot long, right? So this would be something that he would, more like a dagger, So yeah, this was allowed. This the guy's a fisherman. He's not a swordsman, and he's probably just aiming for the guy's head. And he ends up cut the guy's ear off. Is very likely.
Always bait not chicken.
Mhm.
So look back at Luke again. Where is it? Oh yeah. So in verse 50, where we're just looking at, it says that one of them struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his right ear. And then in verse 51, Jesus answered and said, "Permit even this." And he touched his ear and healed him. So this is the only place where we see the healing of the ear. Obviously, in Luke, who is the physician, he has something to say about the healing that's going on. But Jesus touches the ear and heals him. We don't know whether he picked up the ear off the ground and stuck it back on there and reattached it, or whether he grew a new ear. Either way, it's a pretty amazing feat. The other thing to recognize, though, is, right, has no impact on the crowd. No impact on the crowd that he takes this guy's ear and replaces it. The crowd does go, "Oh, wow, what amazing, what an amazing miracle. We all need to turn and follow him." Not what's going on. The other thing is interesting is where what kind of faith did the servant have in order to get this healing? None, right? So again, we have this picture in our minds about healing and the connectivity with faith. But we've seen Jesus on several occasions heal people without, with friends' faith. In this case, without any faith at all. Jesus is doing miracles because Jesus does miracles. Jesus is doing miracles because that's who he is, and he is in control of all things, and he is the creator God. And if he wants to create an ear and put it on this guy's head, that's what he does. So it's just interesting, right? Fascinating, really, that this it's just a display of God's power. It's just a display of who he is, not connected to this man's faith or the faith of Caiaphas or anything else going on here. So at this point, let's go back to Matthew. So he again, he stretched out his hand, he struck the servants of the high priest ear and cut off his ear. Now we have in the next couple of verses is Jesus' response to this event. So in verse 52, he says, "But Jesus said to him, 'Put your sword in its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword.'" He actually gives three reasons here why this is not a good idea. All right. The first one is, if you pull out the sword, you're going to die by the sword. There's going to be punishment for that. There's going to be a payment that you're going to have to make if you actually kill him. For those of you who kept your finger in John chapter 18, look at verse 36, John 18:36. Excuse me. It says, Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight so that I should not be delivered to the Jews, but now my kingdom is not from here." Right? This is actually when he's being interviewed by Pilate, and Pilate's asking him who he is and about, is he really a king? And he says, "Yeah, I'm a king, but not of this world. If I were of this world, my servants would fight." Right? So he's saying, so this is, I believe what he's trying to say here is, put away your sword. For those who take the sword will perish by the sword. This whole thing is not about the sword. This whole kingdom is not about a fight. It's not about a battle. It's not about a battle in the way you think about it. The disciples had a false sense of who they were and who the kingdom was still. Although Jesus has tried to explain it to them over and over and over, they still don't get it. They're still thinking, okay, the Romans are here. This is the time. Jesus, he's knocked them over with his words. This is the time. Let's get in the battle and go forward. They still don't get it. And again, the fundamental thing here is this is not an earthly kingdom. This is not that kind of kingdom that we're talking about. Verse 53 says, or do you think that I cannot now pray to my Father and he will provide me with more than 12 legions of angels? Right? He's just saying to them, yeah, do I really need Peter to stand up for me and protect me? Do I really need 12 disciples with little funky swords to try to protect me? Excuse me. Do you not realize that I can call on God and he would bring down 12,000 angels to protect me? 12 legions of angels. A legion, by the way, is 6,000. So 12 legions is 72,000. He said, I could call unto God and have him bring down 72,000 angels to protect me. I don't need Peter. I don't need you guys pulling out your swords. You don't trust God. I do. I know what God can do. You guys don't. You're trying to take things in your own hands. You think that you know better than God. Listen, he says, if the Lord wanted to deliver us, he would deliver us. If the Lord wants to deliver us, he will deliver us. We'll come back to that. Verse 54. How then could the scriptures be fulfilled that this must happen? And look again and look further down at verse 56. It says, but all this was done that the scriptures of the prophets might be fulfilled. Go back to John 18 again. You getting tired of turning there? Go back to John 18. In his response to Peter, in verse 11, he says this. So Jesus said to Peter, put your sword into its sheath. Shall I not drink the cup which my Father has given me? Right? Shall I not drink the cup that my Father has given me? Now, he uses that same picture again of the cup, right? That he used back in verse 42 in the prayer in the garden, right? This cup of suffering, this cup of punishment that I'm going to have to go under. Peter, do you realize that you're going to mess up the whole plan? You're going. Not only do you not know the plan, you're not in tune with the plan, and you're actually fighting against God's plan by doing this. God's
Peter doing what all the disciples did. They didn't get it. They didn't understand. They wanted Jesus to be the Messiah and to want the kingdom today.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And what's amazing here is that they're fighting against God's plan by doing it, right? They're actually fighting against God by doing this. And so I just wanted to these three lessons are really important for us, right? When struggles come, when we are attacked, right? The first thing we got to recognize, this is not an earthly kingdom. This is not about this stuff. This is not about these people. This is not about this person that's attacking me or this thing that's going on or this disease, right? It's not about this. This is not an earthly kingdom. It's something else. The second thing is, if God wants to deliver us from this situation, he would do so. So, right? He could. 72,000 angels could come down and change the whole situation. So that leads to the third one, was that, God's purposes are going to happen. God's will be done. And we may very well be fighting against God's will if we're not in tune with his plan. If we're not, again, the disciples didn't spend the night in prayer. They weren't in tune. They weren't ready when this thing occurred. And if we're not in tune, if we're not ready, if we're not in prayer, if we're not prayed up when this happens, this attack, this whatever, we could very well be fighting against God in our response. By the way, when he says the scripture might be fulfilled, what is he saying there? What is he talking about? That you might be messing up God's plan. What's in God's plan that they might be messing up?
His dying for our
The whole
sins.
plan of salvation for starters.
I mean, the mega truth is exactly what you said, right? His whole dying for us, his whole plan of salvation, the whole business, the whole big plan. But then remember also that there are prophecy after prophecy in the Old Testament about how this should all occur, right? I just have a short list just to read to you. And if some of you want it, I can send to you later. But let me just go through this, right? It says, one, he's going to be reproached and despised by men in Psalm 22. He's going to be spit upon, smote, and buffeted in Isaiah 1. He's going to be put to death on a cross in Psalm 22. He's going to be buried in Isaiah 53. They're going to sell him for 30 pieces of silver in Zechariah 11. He's going to be betrayed by a familiar friend in Psalm 41. He's going to be seized and apprehended in Isaiah 53. His disciples will forsake him in Zechariah 13. Even God and the Father will forsake him in Psalm 22. He's going to be suffering between two thieves in Isaiah 53. The parting of his garments and the casting lots is in Psalm 22. The giving him gall and vinegar on the cross in Psalm 69. The not breaking of his bones in Psalm 34. I mean, there's a plan. There's a lot of things that have to happen. And you guys are stepping in right when this is beginning and trying to mess up the plan. You've got to get on the same page. And again, the details of our lives that God is in control of, we need to let him be in control of, right? And not be fighting against what God is trying to do, what lessons we're supposed to learn, the impact we're supposed to have on others. Disciples weren't ready for that. All right, verse next, 55, back in Matthew. In that hour, Jesus said to the multitudes, "Have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs to take me? I sat daily with you, teaching in the temple, and you did not seize me." Right? He was saying, just a couple of days ago, I was in the temple. I was there. The crowds were there. The people were there. Everyone was there. You saw what I was doing. I was teaching, right? I wasn't starting an insurrection. I was teaching. I was helping people to understand who God is. And I was there. Why didn't you get me there? Right? He's saying to them, this whole thing, you have no right to do this, right? If you had a right to do this, you would have done it in front of the crowds. But you're afraid of the crowds. You're afraid of the people. And so you're doing this here in the dark at night when the crowds are not around. Well, it's got 1,000 people with them, but the million people that are in Jerusalem for the Passover are obviously not aware of what's going on. Turn back to Luke again if you've kept that marked in Luke 22. Jesus makes an interesting statement here. Luke 22, verse 52, Luke 22, 52, says, "Then Jesus said to the chief priests, captains of the temples, and elders who had come to him, 'Have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs? When I was with you daily in the temple, you did not try to seize me, but this is your hour and the power of darkness.'" So again, I think the idea that Jesus is allowing this to happen. This is your hour. This is the hour of the power of darkness. I'm not going to say another word and knock you down. I'm going to allow this hour to happen. I'm going to allow this time to happen where you take me, where you bind me, where you come against me. I don't know. But this is your hour in the power of darkness. This is your time. This is your opportunity. Go through with it. The other thing I just want to show you, connected to that, we actually read this last week in John 12. You can just listen if you want. John 12, verse 27, when Jesus is talking about the cross. He says, "Now my soul is troubled, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour, but for this purpose I came to this hour." He talks about this hour, and here he identifies this hour as the hour of darkness, the hour when those who are evil, those who are coming against him, will have the upper hand. And then finally in verse 56, all this was done that the scripture of the prophets might be fulfilled, as we've said. And then the end of the verse, however, then all the disciples forsook him and fled. Just as he predicted, they would all deny him, not just Peter. It was all the disciples who said, hey, let's raise up swords, let's attack. They all didn't get it. Here, all the disciples forsook him and fled. Jesus asked the guards, hey, just take me, leave the disciples alone. Why do they flee here? The chief priests and scribes are not after them. It may be because of what Peter did, right? By cutting off the servant's ear, they may have said, well, wait a minute, these guys are going to fight. We're going to have to fight them back. And of course, Jesus is trying to squash all that down and say, no, don't do that. Don't raise your sword, or they're going to have to raise theirs. He heals the servant, but still, all the disciples fled. All the disciples leave. All the disciples exit. So the last thing I've got to ask then is, have we done that? In the moment of testing, in the moment of struggle, in the moment of trial, are we standing with Christ? Or are we fighting against him? Are we leaning on him? Or are we trying to do it ourselves? That's the disciples, right? Taking my sword, trying to do this myself in my power, my ability, and just fleeing Christ and not leaning on Christ, not recognizing God's power, not trusting in God, right? Not recognize. Yeah, go ahead.
I had a thought, and it seems like Jesus knew what was going to happen with the disciples later on as they went out throughout the world. And I think he probably knew to diffuse the situation. If you've got all these Roman soldiers, these guys need to be alive later on because they're going to get it after he comes back alive. I need them to go out into the world and do what they're going to do. So I'm sure Jesus knew that. And that was in addition that had to satisfy the prophets' writings in the past. But that just came to me. I said, he knew that if these guys tried to fight the Roman soldiers, that ain't going to end up happy.
Yeah, absolutely. Of course, eventually they all do get martyred, but that's a little bit later in the story, right? Yeah. Oh, good point. And I think that's why he says to them, he says to the officers, hey, you're here for me. Leave these guys alone. Let them go. He had a plan for them. God was protecting them. God was watching out for them, right? Even in their fleeing, God's watching out for them and watching after them and watching what they're doing. But again, the disciples, don't recognize that this is not a earthly kingdom, right? They don't recognize that God could come down and bring a much larger army of angels against this multitude. And again, they don't recognize this is all in his plan. And so to me, those are the three key lessons for us. That's really important to see, again, because these disciples are just like us, dumb dinglings that respond in the same way. So, all right. So then verse 50 next, verse 57, and those who laid hold of Jesus led him away to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and elders were assembled. So the whole group, so we're stopping here, but I'm just letting you know that's where we're going. The scribes and elders are all together. They gave the plan to Judas. He went out and did the plan. They bring him back to Caiaphas, the high priest, the scribes and elders, and then we'll talk about the quote trial next time. All right, anything else on this?
Good lesson, Rich.
Well, it's just, unfortunately, we see ourselves very often in these pictures as we go through this last week, and this is one of them. All right, let me turn off the recording.